A lot of us are talking about the silver lining of a potential stimulus bill that might generate a lot of infrastructure money for building new parks, for restoring existing parks. And maybe if we're smart enough, we put in enough significant money in the federal budget, we can create a new WPA, a new CCC to put a lot of people back to work building the big new parks or even the small new parks for the 21st century.
Great. And that would be in CARES Act too, or is that a separate bill that you trust
I
Republic
think
Land is
I
hoping it
think
would happen?
so. We're pretty sure, fingers crossed, that the Land and Water Conservation Fund will be fully funded. This being debated by the Senate even as we speak. I think
Okay.
tomorrow, then the House will have to approve it. And by fully funded, that's $900 million a year to go toward land protection, land conservation, and park creation. It's a drop in the bucket, frankly. It really wouldn't do that much to really create a lot of new parks, but would provide a good chunk of money to the national park system. CARES also includes extra funding to redress the years and years of deferred maintenance at the National Park Service. It could be very important. What's not in any bill yet is significant money to go directly to cities as pass-through money, sort of like what we used to have, something called UPAR. 30 years ago, UPAR was a significant federal funding source where money went directly to cities for disadvantaged communities to build parks. And so some of the parks and conservation organizations are working to create additional funding mechanisms in a separate stimulus bill, which is likely to come up perhaps in July.
Adrian, can you give us a 2-minute overview of the role for Trust for Public Land and specifically your role?
Trust for Public Land is closing in on its 50th anniversary. We started in 1972 in Northern California, and the whole mission of Trust for Public Land as a nonprofit is to provide what we call land for people and parks for people. Our whole mission is to create lots more public space, public land, and parks for people to enjoy connections with nature. We don't do wildlife preserves. We're all about people interacting with parks, nature, and open space. I oversee kind of the thought leadership on parks across America at the Trust for Public Land. We have a team of experts that include thought leaders in climate change in parks, public health in parks, community and equity in parks, and also the 10-Minute Walk Mayors campaign, which is a campaign aimed at mayors, as the name implies, to get them to commit to and act on the idea that everybody in every city should have a high-quality park within a 10-minute walk, with a very specific focus on equity, that it's not enough to have a park, it's got to be a good park, and we have to particularly focus in on providing good parks for public health, for community health, for social health, and for environmental health, and particularly for people in underserved communities.
Well, you talked a little bit about the financial hardship we're in right now, especially with Parks Departments doing layoffs as we speak, right? So what's the most creative park financing and funding mechanism that you've seen in the US that we can turn to as budgets shrink? If we consider that maybe federal funding isn't going to happen as much as we need, what are some other tools that you've seen work?
Well, first, I think we've got to hold our representatives' feet to the fire and make sure that there is significant federal funding. We need a new CCC and a new WPA to put people to work. There are many, many ways to find funding. I used to joke that, you can print money in your basement. But the Trust for Public Land in particular has worked on issues of finance, what we call park finance or conservation finance. That is finding money. A very popular way to find extra money for parks is what we call ballot measures. That is, we work with the community, with elected officials, with advocates to say there should be a certain percentage of the sales tax, say, dedicated to parks, or we'll raise the sales tax by 0.25%, and all that increment goes to parks. In Los Angeles recently, there was a measure to increase the property tax rates. It was approved by 81% of the voters in LA County, where they all agreed to pay higher property taxes if that money would go to create $5 billion for parks in LA County. There are things called park districts. Seattle has a park district where, they created a separate taxing authority just to create a separate tax to add about $70 million a year for Seattle parks. Chicago is fully funded by its own independent park districts. So if you live in Chicago, you pay your property tax, your school tax, and a park tax. And the independent park district has a floor of funding. You can do public-private partnerships with nonprofit groups that raise private money. That doesn't work in every community. It's been very successful in some. It generates about $800 million a year in private revenue for public parks across the country. But it's really in New York City, it's in Boston, it's in a few cities, but even big sophisticated cities like San Francisco just have two or three big park organizations that raise a lot of money. There's probably a dozen in New York City. You've got 4 or 5 in Louisville, Kentucky. So there's a little bit all over, but we should never count on the private sector to provide the bulk of the support for public parks. We have to hold mayors responsible, hold governors responsible, hold county executives responsible. Say this is a very important. It's not an amenity. It's a very important basic service.
Yeah.
And explain to them how vital. You can't have good public health without a good park system. You can't have clean air and clean water without an extensive park system. You can't mitigate the impacts of climate change without a lot of parks and trees. And you can't have frankly, and this is where you can really talk to the mayors, your economic viability depends on having a great park system. Nobody's going to want to live in a city that has terrible park system. And we can show you example after example of this, that the popular cities that people have been moving to are the cities with good park systems.